Lucas parked his car at the entrance of the old country house. The site of the property, now his by right, was a mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. He hadn't visited the place since childhood, when his grandmother was still alive. Now the house was at the mercy of time, with its faded walls and dusty, fogged windows accumulated over the years. An unusual silence hung in the air, interrupted only by the wind gently swaying the trees around. As he got out of the car, Lucas felt a chill. The house, with its slanted roof and rusty porch, seemed to watch him back, as if it were a living entity aware of his presence. He hesitated before opening the iron gate, creaked under the weight of time. Crossing the threshold of the property, a sense of déjà vu enveloped him. He vaguely remembered the stories his family told about the house. How no one liked to stay there for long, as if there was something unsettling about the place. Inside the house, the smell of mold and aged wood was strong. He walked down the narrow hallway, passing by old portraits hanging on the walls, all framed in dark wood. Familiar faces watched him with serious expression, as if guarding secrets he wasn't yet ready to uncover. In one of the rooms he found an old photo box. Among the black and white images, one stood out, a photograph of his young mother, standing on the porch of the house, smiling enigmatically. Twilight was approaching when Lucas finished exploring the first floor. Despite the quietness of the place, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. But the fatigue from the journey weighed on him, and he decided that exploring the rest of the house could wait until the next day. He chose a room on the second floor, the one that seemed the least dusty, and lay down on the old bed, listening to the sound of the wind blowing outside. As he closed his eyes, Lucas couldn't help but think that there was a certain tension in the air, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for something. And he, unknowingly, was about to discover what that was. The morning sun streamed through the dusty curtains, illuminating the room with a pale light. Lucas woke up early, still a bit unsettled from the previous night. The silence of the house felt heavier in the daylight, but he decided to ignore the discomfort and continue exploring the place he would now call home, at least temporarily. Outside, the morning breeze was fresh, bringing with it the scent of the surrounding trees. Lucas walked around the house, observing the ancient trees that surrounded the property and the tall grass that had overtaken the garden. He walked to the back of the property, where he came across something he didn't remember seeing during his childhood visits. An ancient well, covered by a stone lid, with rusted chains wrapped around it, holding it firmly shut. Curious, Lucas approached. The lid of the well was heavy and cold to the touch. The chains seemed to have been there for decades, already integrated by rust and time. He crouched down, trying to see anything through the small openings between the chains and the stone. All he saw was darkness. A feeling of unease began to take hold of him, but he pushed the sensation away, convinced it was just the irrational fear of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Deciding not to worry about the well for now, Lucas returned to the house. However, as night fell, while he was preparing for bed, a soft, strange sound caught his attention. He froze, trying to identify where it was coming from. It was a low murmur, almost imperceptible, that seemed to come from outside. Lucas opened the window of his room and looked out into the garden, but saw nothing but darkness and the shadows cast by the trees. The sound, however, persisted. It was as if someone was whispering his name, a faint but insistent call. The voice seemed to be carried by the wind coming from somewhere on the property. His heart raced, and he quickly closed the window, trying to ignore what he heard. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks on his mind, he thought, though the feeling of discomfort didn't leave him. Lucas lay down, trying to shake off the strange feeling that troubled him. But the sound continued to echo in his mind, even as he fell into a restless and agitated sleep. In the following days, the persistent sound continued to haunt Lucas. During the day, he tried to keep busy with tasks around the house, cleaning the dusty rooms and attempting to restore a bit of the place's former glory. However, every night without exception he heard the same whisper coming from outside, always calling his name, always faint but increasingly clear. It was on the third day that something finally broke inside him. Exhausted and consumed by curiosity, Lucas decided to investigate the source of the voice. armed with a flashlight and a courage he knew was foolish, he ventured into the garden in the dead of night. The light from the flashlight swayed as he crossed the lawn, the beam revealing only the grotesque shadows of the trees. The murmur guided him like an invisible current, pulling him to the back of the property. Finally, he stopped in front of the locked well. The sound was stronger there, the call now as clear as day. Lucas. His blood ran cold. He recognized that voice. It was the voice of his mother, the mother who had disappeared when he was still a child. A wave of shock and disbelief hit him, but the whisper continued, increasingly insistent, pleading for help, begging to be freed. Lucas fell to his knees, pointing the flashlight at the well. He wanted to believe he was dreaming, that his mind was playing tricks on him. The sound was unmistakable. His mother's voice, the voice he hadn't heard in so many years, was there, trapped in that well and crying out for help. Desperate and confused, Lucas spent the next night wide awake, trying to understand what was happening. He began to question his sanity. Was it possible that the isolation and the pain of losing his parents were affecting his mind? Could it be that his mother was alive, somehow trapped in that well, or was it some kind of illusion? Lucas's mind swirled with unanswered questions. Determined to find some explanation, he began to search the house for any clues that could shed light on the mystery. It was then that on one of the dusty shelves in the basement, he found an old diary, with a worn leather cover and his grandmother's name embossed in faded letters. With trembling hands, Lucas opened the diary. First pages contained common entries, notes about daily life, recipes for home remedies, and reflections on family. But as he progressed, the entries grew darker. His grandmother recounted hearing a voice coming from the well, a voice that pretended to be her daughter, Lucas's mother. She described the fear she felt, the certainty that something evil was trapped down there, something that should not be released. Chill ran down Lucas's spine. Whatever was in that well, his grandmother believed it was not his mother, but rather an entity that was using her voice to deceive people. And now, this thing was trying to trick Lucas. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into dangerous territory. What had once seemed like an intriguing mystery was turning into something much more sinister. He spent the next days immersed in the pages of his grandmother's diary, each line revealing more about the horrors she faced in the house, and especially about the well. As Lucas delved deeper into the reading, it became clear that his grandmother had fought against the malignant presence for years. She described how, over time, the voice coming from the well became more convincing, adopting different tones and emotions to try to persuade her to release it. In one of the most disturbing entries, his grandmother recounted a dream where she saw her daughter, Lucas's mother, chained at the bottom of the well, pleading to be freed. In the dream, the grandmother tried to help her, but whenever she got close, the figure transformed into something monstrous and unknown, causing her to wake up in terror. The diary also mentioned that his grandmother had tried to seek help from religious figures and occult specialists, but no one could explain what exactly was trapped in the well. Some suggested it could be an evil spirit, while others believed it could be an entity created by his grandmother's own fears and regrets. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the well should remain locked. The final notes of the diary were almost illegible, written in a trembling handwriting. His grandmother seemed increasingly haunted by the voice and the fear of what could happen if the well were open. In one of her last entries, she confessed that she didn't have the courage to destroy the well, fearing that it might release the entity instead of containing it. Instead, she chose to reinforce the chains and avoid the location, hoping that with time, the thing inside the well would weaken and disappear. Lucas closed the diary with trembling hands. His grandmother's words reverberated in his mind. She had felt the same terror, the same uncertainty. But unlike her, Lucas couldn't ignore the calls of the voice he heard. Now he was convinced that he needed to uncover what was really happening, even if it meant confronting the danger his grandmother had feared her entire life. In the following days, the presence of the well in his mind became unbearable. Lucas's nights were dominated by disturbing dreams in which he saw his mother trapped at the bottom, suffering, begging for his help. In every dream, he descended into the well, that only to wake up in a cold sweat before reaching the bottom. Each morning, he woke up more exhausted, more consumed by the need to solve the mystery. Lucas knew he couldn't continue like that. The doubt and fear were consuming him from the inside out, and the voice was becoming more insistent every night. Finally, he decided that there was only one way to end it. He needed to open the well and confront whatever was down there. He knew it was madness, that he was risking something unknown and dangerous. But the need to uncover the truth about his mother was stronger than any warning contained in the diary. That night, Lucas prepared for the task that he knew would change his life forever. With his grandmother's diary in hand, he reread the last words written, as if seeking courage in her words. Then he took a flashlight, a rope, and a hammer to break the chains and headed to the garden, where the well awaited him, motionless and threatening under the faint light of the moon. The night was particularly silent as Lucas approached the well, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, reflecting his inner state of nervousness and fear. The rusty chains, which just days ago seemed insurmountable, were now merely an obstacle to be overcome in his quest for the truth. Lucas hesitated for a moment with the hammer raised in the air, questioning whether he was about to make an irreversible mistake. His grandmother's warning words echoed in his mind. The well must remain locked. But the continuous whisper of his mother's voice, now clear and unmistakable, seemed to pull him with an irresistible force. "Lucas, please, help me." In a moment of impulse, he set aside his doubts and brought the hammer down hard on the chains. The metallic sound reverberated through the garden, loud and disturbing in the stillness of the night. After a few strikes, the chains finally gave way, releasing themselves from the stone lid that covered the well. Lucas took a deep breath before pushing the heavy lid, which moved with difficulty, revealing the absolute darkness inside the well. Firmly holding the lantern and tying the rope around his waist, he began to descend. The air around him seemed to grow colder with each meter he went down, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the rope rubbing against the stone. Lucas kept his eyes fixed on the darkness below, trying to see what awaited him at the bottom. Finally, his feet touched the damp and uneven ground at the bottom of the well. The lantern revealed the walls covered in slime, but there was no sign of his mother or anything else. But then, something shimmered in the light of the lantern, something metallic and ancient. Lucas bent down and found an old, dusty medallion, but still intact. He recognized it immediately. It was his mother's medallion, the one she always wore when he was a child. The initial relief of having found something tangible was quickly replaced by overwhelming fear. As he held the medallion, a wave of energy coursed through his body, and the voice that had once called him now seemed to come from within his own mind. "Lucas, you found me. Help me get out." The voice had changed, deeper, darker. Suddenly, the environment around him began to shift. The walls of the well seemed to move, pulsating as if they were alive. Lucas felt a chill as he realized that something was very wrong. The voice that had lured him there was not his mother's. It was something that used her memory to manipulate his feelings, to deceive him. He tried to let go of the medallion, but his fingers felt glued to the object. It was as if an invisible force was holding him, preventing him from escaping. The voice continued to whisper, now with an urgency that sounded almost triumphant. "You came to me. Now, free me completely." Lucas realized he was on the brink of something terrible. The entity wanted him to do more than just free it from the well. It wanted to possess something much more valuable. Fighting against the panic that threatened to overtake him, he remembered his grandmother's diary and the warnings contained within it. Destroying the medallion was the only way to prevent the entity from taking complete control. Gathering all his willpower, Lucas raised the lantern and, with a determined motion, smashed the medallion against the stone wall of the well. A deafening scream echoed around him, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, filled with rage and despair. The well began to shake, and Lucas, sensing the imminent danger, grabbed the rope and started to climb frantically. As he ascended, the well seemed to close around him, as if the very earth was trying to trap him there forever. But he didn't stop, driven by fear and adrenaline, until he finally emerged at the surface, gasping and terrified. Behind him, the well collapsed, its ancient structure giving way under the invisible force he had awakened. Lucas stumbled away from the crumbling well, his lungs burning from the effort. Sweat dripped down his face as he tried to catch his breath and process what had just happened. The ground still trembled lightly, as if the earth was calming down after a violent convulsion. He looked back at the spot where the well had been, now just a pile of stones and sunken dirt, and felt a mix of relief and dread. However, the relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of terror. A chilling presence filled the air around him, and Lucas knew that whatever he had done by destroying the medallion had not solved the problem. On the contrary, it seemed to have unleashed something even more dangerous. The shadows around the house began to move strangely, twisting as if they had a life of their own. A deep, guttural sound echoed from deep within the earth, resonating throughout the property. Lucas felt his heart hammering in his chest. He realized that what had been trapped in the well, that entity that had used his mother's voice, was now loose and furious. The malignant presence that had once been contained, even if partially, now seemed free to spread throughout the house and the grounds. Seeking revenge, Lucas ran for the house, his only thought being to find some sort of refuge. But as soon as he entered, he realized that the house was no longer the same place he had entered days before. The walls seemed alive, pulsating as if a heart beat somewhere within them. The furniture trembled slightly, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy that made Lucas feel suffocated. He knew he couldn't stay there, but he also had nowhere to go. The environment around him seemed to close in more and more, as if the house was conspiring against him, determined not to let him escape. Flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment he was enveloped in complete darkness. It was in that instant that he heard, once again, the voice of the entity, this time directly in his mind. "You cannot escape. You are destined to be with me, forever." Reality seemed distorted, the rooms of the house transforming into labyrinths with no exit. Lucas felt panic take over his body, but something inside him resisted. He knew he needed to focus, that he needed to find a way to confront the entity before it consumed him completely. Remembering his grandmother's words, the well must remain locked. This meant that the well was the key, not to free the entity, but to contain it again. Fighting against the terror surrounding him, Lucas ran to the basement, where he knew there were tools that could help him rebuild what he had destroyed. He grabbed a shovel and a bag of cement he found in a dusty corner, determined to seal what had collapsed before it was too late. With all the strength he had left, Lucas returned to the garden, where the well was now just an opening in the ground. As he frantically dug, trying to cover the opening, the entity attacked, trying to wrench the shovel from his hands, blowing icy winds and trying to collapse the invisible walls of protection he was erecting around himself. But Lucas held firm. Every time he felt his strength wavering, he thought of his mother, of his grandmother, and the legacy of pain that entity had imposed on his family. He would not let it continue. After what felt like hours of exhausting work, Lucas finally managed to cover the opening with a makeshift layer of cement. The weight of the earth and stones over the well was now greater, but he knew that wouldn't be enough to completely contain the entity. Still, he used his last reserves of energy to whisper a prayer, asking that the evil be sealed forever. The sound around him began to dissipate slowly, as if the malevolent presence was being forced to retreat back to the depths from where it came. The feeling of oppression started to lessen, and the shadows around the house seemed to return to normal, static and lifeless. Lucas, exhausted, fell to his knees, dirty from dirt and sweat, but with the feeling that, somehow, he had won, at least for now. He knew he couldn't stay in that house. It was time to leave it forever. But before he went, Lucas took one last look at the now silent garden. The well was sealed again, but he knew that the danger would never be completely gone. With slow, heavy steps, he walked away, determined to do what his grandmother had never had the courage to do: destroy the house and bury forever what was left of its curse. Lucas woke up to the sunlight filtering through the living room windows. He didn't know exactly when he had passed out, but the silence around him was a sign that, at least for now, the nightmare was over. He was lying on the floor, still dirty from dirt, with sore muscles and a mind dazed by the events of the previous night. But the most important thing was that he was alive and free. The house around him was quiet. The environment seemed to have returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after what had happened. He stood up with difficulty and looked around. The walls no longer pulsed, and the shadows seemed to have no life of their own anymore. Everything was in a strange calm, as if the house itself was exhausted after the battle that had taken place. Lucas knew he couldn't stay there much longer. Although he had managed to seal the well, the presence of the entity had left an indelible mark on that place, and he was not willing to take any more risks. He needed to get out of there and finally put an end to what remained of the curse that had plagued his family. Determined, Lucas spent the morning packing his things. His grandmother's diary was the only object in the house that he decided to take with him. Before leaving, he took one last look at the living room, trying to say goodbye to the memories that still lingered there. He knew that destroying the house would be painful, but it was also necessary to end that cycle of suffering that had tormented his family for generations. Without wasting any more time, he headed to the nearest town and hired a demolition crew. He explained that the house was old and in ruins, that he wanted to tear it down and clear the land. He didn't mention anything about the well or the entity he had fought the night before. Some secrets he knew were better left buried. In the days that followed, Lucas watched the demolition of the house from a distance. Each wall that fell, each piece of wood that splintered, seemed to lift a weight off his shoulders. When the last wall finally came down, he felt a relief he couldn't describe. It was as if a curse had been broken, as if his family was finally free. With the house reduced to rubble and the land cleared, Lucas made the decision to sell the property. He didn't want anything more to do with that place, not even the empty lot. However, before handing over the keys and saying goodbye for good, he made one last visit to the site. The garden was unrecognizable, without the house to cast its shadows over it. The well, now sealed and covered in debris, was just a memory of what it had been. Lucas walked to where it used to stand, feeling a last vestige of unease, as he remembered everything that had happened. But now there was also a sense of closure, that he had done everything he could to protect the future of his family and anyone else who might cross that path. In a final gesture of respect, Lucas placed his grandmother's diary on top of the rubble of the well. It wasn't a tomb, but it seemed fitting to leave there the words of someone who had faced evil before him, so they would remain as a reminder of what had been sealed forever. He left the lot for the last time with a mixture of sadness and relief. He knew he could never forget what he had been through there, but he also knew he was ready to move on. The past was buried, along with the house and the well. Now, it was time to start over, somewhere else, far from the shadows that had haunted him for so long. A few weeks after the demolition of the house, Lucas returned to the town just for one last task before finally saying goodbye to that chapter of his life. He made his way to the cemetery where his mother was buried, a small and quiet field of tombstones surrounded by ancient trees. It was a peaceful place, very different from the heavy atmosphere that always surrounded the country house. Carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, Lucas walked slowly to his mother's grave. Upon arrival, he knelt before the headstone, feeling a mix of longing and relief. He gently placed the flowers on the cold marble and spent a few minutes in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. "It seems we finally did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice laden with emotion. "I hope you're at peace now." The gentle breeze passing through the cemetery rustled the leaves of the trees, creating a calming sound. Lucas stood up, ready to leave. Before he could turn, he felt a cold draft brush against his neck, a sensation he knew well but hadn't expected to feel there. For a brief moment he heard a whisper, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, "Thank you." The voice was soft, familiar, and brought tears to his eyes. He closed his eyes, absorbing the moment, believing it was his mother finally thanking him for freeing her. But when he opened his eyes again, he saw something that made his heart freeze. In the shadow of one of the trees in the distance, there was an indistinct figure, something that seemed to be watching from afar. Lucas blinked, and the figure vanished, as if it had never been there. He stood still, his heart pounding. He knew what he had seen was not a mere illusion. An unsettling feeling took hold of him, a reminder that despite all his efforts, the evil he faced might never be completely eradicated. With one last look at his mother's grave, Lucas turned and left the cemetery, determined to move forward with his life, but aware that some shadows could always follow him. As he walked away, the breeze turned cold again, and the silence of the cemetery was broken by a final whisper, lost among the trees. Lucas did not look back. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, some parts of the past could never be completely left behind.